Welcome to our Dean's Colloquium this evening, where we'll be celebrating the publication of Nabokov on the Heights, New Studies from Boston College. Before we begin the program, I thought it would be good for us to take a moment in prayer to remember Jalila Dunlop, who many of you know died last night here on campus. So let's pray for her family, her friends, her faculty, all those who are affected by this terribly sad event. May God bring quiet and peace and hope to all those who are affected by this very sad event. Amen. We gather to celebrate a really important project and an interesting interdisciplinary, integrative project that brings together faculty members and students, undergraduates and graduate students, resulting in this wonderful new book edited by Professor Maxim Shrayer. Maxim will lead the conversation, but it's my pleasure to introduce the other folks who are here on the panel, contributors to the volume. We have with us today Nina Khaghany, who graduated from BC in 2024 and recently completed an MA in English at Columbia University. Matthew Leiberg, who graduated in 2000, he's currently Global Head of AI, Asset Management and Product at Manulife Wealth and Asset Management. Katie Pelkey, who finished her master's degree here in 2024, is pursuing an MFA in creative writing from Syracuse University. And Eric Weiscott, professor of English at Boston College and author of Cycle of Dreams. The conversation today will be moderated by Professor Maxim Shrayer, chair of the Department of Eastern Slavic and German Studies and the author of Zion Square, well known to all of us here. And congratulations to Maxim and all the panelists for this wonderful publication. With that, I'll turn things over to him.
Thank you so much, Greg, for your support. I just said to Greg that I consider him a contributor in many ways. As you know, this is a collective project, a collaborative project, and in fact, I'll just say that among the contributors are 3 former undergraduates who were part of the Nabokov seminar, 7 former and current graduate students, and 3 faculty members. An ideal launch would have all the voices represented in this book here before you, but we all live in different parts of the country, if not the world. So some of us are here, but we prepared a little flick in which each contributor speaks very, very briefly. In fact, it was a kind of draconian task. I asked each to speak for under a minute, and we recorded a little flick that we're going to play for you so that you have a sense of the voices. And after that, we will have an actual conversation that will include Nina, Matthew, Katie, and Eric. And I also want to say that there is at least one other contributor here on the floor, Megumi Dumond, and we're very happy that she is here from Seattle, right, Megumi? And I think she will also participate from the floor. So without further ado, if the equipment cooperates.
Nabokov. Vladimir Nabokov. Vladimir Nabokov.
My name is Maxim Shrayer, and it's a real pleasure and an honor to introduce Nabokov on the Heights, New Studies from Boston College, a book that I edited and curated here at Boston College, where I've been teaching since 1996. And for almost as long as I've been teaching at Boston College, I've been teaching a research seminar on the works, on the life and legacy of Vladimir Nabokov, the great Russian-American writer who came to the United States in 1940 as a refugee, having rescued his Jewish wife and son. Nabokov's early life as an American writer, as an American professor, and as an American entomologist began here in Boston. The book showcases contributions by a group of very talented former undergraduate and graduate students who were participants in the Nabokov seminar, and also by Boston College faculty who work on Vladimir Nabokov. I would like to offer our thanks to those professors and colleagues who supported our project, and especially to Provost David Quigley, to Dean Gregory Kalscheur, S.J., of the Morrissey College of Arts and Sciences, and to Christian Dupont, Associate University Librarian and Burns Librarian. And we would also like to thank Academic Studies Press, our publisher, for believing in our book from its outset and for producing such a beautiful volume. Now, a very brief note about my contributions. I contributed an essay which deals with the transformation of Vladimir Nabokov's views of religious conversion and apostasy after World War II and the Shoah. And I also contributed some archival materials pertaining to Nabokov's early American years here in Boston. I would like to welcome you to this project. You will now hear from its contributors. And thanks again for being with us and for your interest in Nabokov on the Heights, New Studies from Boston College.
I'm Eric Weisskott. My contribution to this edited collection is entitled Angst and Asymptote, the Success Motif in Nabokov's Fiction. Now, Success is a fictitious novel inside of Nabokov's novel, The Real Life of Sebastian Knight. Success is Sebastian Knight's second novel. So it's not a novel you can read, but it is a novel you can read in another sense because its plot was used by Nabokov elsewhere, as well as inside of The Real Life of Sebastian Knight. So my essay is about how this plot, which is a man and a woman almost meeting and then finally meeting, or often finally meeting, is articulated in Nabokov's early short stories, in the middle of his career, especially in the two novels on either side of his language change, the last Russian novel, which is The Gift, and the first English novel, which is The Real Life of Sebastian Knight, and then also in his later fiction. So there's this spooky effect where this fictitious novel that he gives to his character in The Real Life of Sebastian Knight is also a real novel that he kept writing and rewriting across his career.
Hi, I'm Megumi Demond, and I contributed the essay Unlimited Time, Visual Art and Temporality in Vladimir Nabokov's La Veneziana and The Visit to the Museum. The gist of these essays was my exploration of how visual artworks, like his paintings, sculptures, physical artifacts, influenced the very specific temporality and metaphysics that Nabokov created in many of his works, and how the key characters and reader can experience this collapsed sense of past, present, and future. I'd like to thank everyone who contributed to this collection and Maxim Shrayer for his guidance, and conclude by saying that in this uncertain time for arts and liberty, I feel especially privileged and grateful to have been able to work with colleagues and classmates to have rigorous intellectual discussion and, moreover, just joy in contemplating art. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sierra. For this book, I wrote the chapter Marriage and Its Discontents, where I talk about how Nabokov writes marriages and romantic relationships in a lot of his fiction through novels and short stories. And I also talk about his own marriage to his wife, Vera. So the most interesting part of writing this for me was going through their historical sources, biographies, a lot of letters from Nabokov to his wife, and seeing how the reality of their marriage kind of overlapped with some of his fiction, getting to tease out some semi-autobiographical things in his fiction, and just getting to read a little bit more about Nabokov, the person, as well as his fictional works.
Hi everyone, my name is Nina Khaghany, and it is such a privilege to be a part of this book. Moreover, it was such an honor to write my chapter on two literary legends and my literary heroes, Vladimir Nabokov, of course, and James Joyce. My chapter is the fourth in the book, and like I said, it was so special for me to be able to discuss Nabokov's relationship to Ulysses, because Nabokov's attachment to Ulysses and his characters represent deep emotions that one feels when they're estranged from their home, and how they can capture memories of their loved ones. I owe so much to Professor Shrayer for helping me unravel the characters Cincinnati C. and Leopold Bloom, who offer endless insight. And I wrote this chapter as an undergraduate student, so it was so inspiring to work alongside these scholars who contributed to this book. I owe so much to my alma mater, Boston College, for granting me the position to be able to write and to contribute to this project. This book is truly one of a kind, and it should be taken in by other universities as inspiration for what new scholarship can look like and who can be the ones to write it. So thank you again.
Nabokov's fascination with the game of chess is well known. Not only did he compose and publish chess problems, he also made explicit reference to chess in many of his novels. While a number of critics have picked up on this, writings on the role of chess in Nabokov's fiction have been largely confined to the levels of theme and metaphor. But Nabokov knew the rules of the game, knew and cared deeply about them, and assuming we can interrogate the impact of chess on his fiction writing without pulling in the actual mechanics of the game would be doing him a bit of a disservice. Encouraged, as all of us in Professor Schreyer's course were, to find gaps in current Nabokov scholarship, I searched for ways in which the mechanics of chess play structured the poetics of his writing. I discovered just such a structuring device in the figure of the knight. The knight, in common parlance, is able to jump over other pieces, to pass briefly above the plane of the board each time it moves. It is also the only piece whose movement takes the course of an L shape rather than a straight line. Nabokov's protagonists, similarly, are able to move above the plane of humdrum reality into what Nabokovian critics call the other world, a realm of idealized love and memory. Their movements during these journeys, logically, temporally, even spatially, are anything but linear.
Is Fiona Stacy, and I'm the author of Sharing Other Worlds, Companionship and Co-Authorship in Glory and the Gift. These are two of Nabokov's works written in the 1930s, and while they are drastically different from one another in form, they are distinct from many of Nabokov's other works in that they are arguably both coming-of-age stories for their male protagonists. What first got me interested in exploring the text parallels was the co-authorial relationships that the protagonists, Martin and Fyodor, share with their respective romantic interests, Sonia and Zina. While previous critics have noted Zina's co-authorship with Fyodor, I wanted to compare that to Martin's co-creation of a fictional world with Sonia. Through that first point of contact, I was able to put these works into conversation with one another, and from there, I concluded both that Nabokov makes a rare exception to the typical solipsism of his works by allowing collaboration between these characters and their romantic interests, and that the privileged position of these romantic interests mirrors Nabokov's co-authorial relationship with his own characters. So thank you to Maxim Shrayer and my peers at Boston College for collaborating to make this work happen.
Hi, I'm Jared Hackworth, and my essay in the collection is titled Other Disenchanted Motels, Nabokov's Chronicles of Suburban America. My project came out of my urban studies and American studies background, and then in my time doing my master's in English at Boston College, we got to study all these Nabokov novels together. And it just really excited my urban studies background and in studying suburbanization, as well as reading Nabokov's novels. I argue in my paper that in his American novels, Penin and Lolita, Nabokov resists the dominating cultural script of mid-century American suburbanization. So at this time, all these suburban cultural values of the single-family home, with the single family, with a mother and a father and two children, and the automobile that takes you downtown to work on the freeway, all these new innovations Nabokov is criticizing through his outsider and immigrant protagonists of Humbert Humbert and Timothy Penin. That are inversions of each other as he critiqued suburbia's constitutive faults.
Hi, I'm Katie Pelkey, and I'm the author of the essay Questions of Style and Technique, Death and Immortality in the Work of Vladimir Nabokov. In my early experiences with Nabokov, I was really struck by moments where the author would insert himself into the text using the pronoun I in order to enable a character's death. Sort of like he was directing his characters to kind of just exit the stage. And my interest in this really became the point of departure for this paper, which ultimately considers how Nabokov's stylized exits promote continuity of the characters rather than their discontinuity, and also open the door for more metaphysical interpretations. I also consider whether these dead characters, who have been freed from time, draw a parallel to the author's potential desire to experience timelessness. Maybe Nabokov was anticipating his own post-mortem legacy and his own continuity through art. As a writer, I find this idea very compelling, that someone's art can live past their body's expiration date, and I do think that Nabokov did just that in his own work. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy reading the book.
Lolita, light of my life, fire of my loins, my sin, my soul. Lolita, the tip of the tongue taking a trip of 3 steps down the palate to tap it free on the teeth. Lolita.
Hey everyone, Brendan here, speaking to you today about my essay in this collection, Vladimir Nabokov and the Fruits of Fiction. My essay is really born from the question, what is going on with all of the food imagery and metaphor found throughout Nabokov's novels? And it's one of these questions that as soon as you ask it, you start to see evidence for it everywhere. And so if there is one key takeaway that I hope readers get from reading this essay, it's that we start to treat the gastronomical aspect of Nabokov's works with the seriousness and the candor that they deserve. Speaking briefly about this project as a whole, I think that it is a culmination of what was a rare and unique set of circumstances within the classroom, fostered, of course, by Professor Shrayer. And so I'd really like to thank him. I'd like to thank all of the collaborators and the greater BC community for helping to foster such a great academic atmosphere to make this work possible.
Hi, my name is Samuel Peterson, and I authored the chapter Negotiating Nabokov Within America's Political and Social Context. I'm a recent graduate from Boston College, and when I think about the process of writing this chapter and how this book came together, it was one of the highlights of my undergrad experience. This project began when I was in the spring of my sophomore year in Professor Schreyer's Nabokov seminar, and over the next months and years, without any credit, we, myself, and all the other contributors, at least the students, worked on turning our term papers into academic articles and then what finally became chapters in this book. It was really special to be able to work on something that is not only in addition to the scholarship about Vladimir Nabokov, but Nabokov on the Heights is a time capsule of what we discussed in what was one of the finest classes that I took during my time at Boston College. And I couldn't be happier about how everything has turned out. Thank you so much.
Hello, my name is Matthew Liebert, and my contribution to the Nabokov on the Heights book was a chapter from my senior thesis, a photo essay on Nabokov's life in Boston. The interesting part about that thesis is I turned it in over 20 years ago. And so when Professor Shrayer emailed me and offered the chance to do this, it was a mix of panic, that dream you wake up and the exams due, the papers due, and you're just not ready. And also excitement because Professor Shrayer made such an incredible difference for me, both during my time at Boston College and in subsequent years. So I was very excited to go back, have the chance to go back to the library, complete some of the research topics I didn't get a chance to, and really share this incredible experience that I had and looking at this gifted author's life and trying to find moments in the day-to-day life of the city that may have gone through to the works. So thank you very much. I'd be very excited for you to take a look and have a great rest of the day.
I'm still Maxim Shrayer. And I wanted to offer one more round of thanks to all the contributors to and supporters of Nabokov on the Heights, New Studies from Boston College. As you read the book, you will discover that twice in the 1960s, Boston College tried to bring Vladimir Nabokov to the Heights with a lecture or a reading. Twice, then the legendary Francis Sweeney, S.J., who ran what was called the Humanities series, wrote to Vladimir Nabokov in Montreux, Switzerland, and invited him to speak at BC. And twice, Nabokov replied through his wife, Vera, that he was open to the idea, but was unable to commit at the time. I'm very happy that 70 years later, Vladimir Nabokov is finally here with us at Boston College, and I'm finally able to ask him the question that I've wanted to ask for a very long time. Mr. Nabokov, Vladimir Vladimirovich, why is it that you dislike Dr. Freud so very much?
I think it's medieval. And I don't want an elderly gentleman from Vienna with an umbrella inflicting his dreams upon me. I don't have the dreams that he discusses in his books. I don't see umbrellas in my dream or balloons. I think that takes care of your question. Nabokov.
Thank you. And that was a little flick, and now comes the live part. So thanks again. And I'd like to first turn to my good friend and colleague, Eric Weisskott, who's a professor of English, a scholar, and a poet. And I want to ask him to talk about his experience working on this essay, being part of this project, and perhaps also where he is now and he's thinking about it.
Or is this a good volume? Okay. Thank you all for being here. I'm very grateful to be part of this volume. I'm a medievalist focusing on 14th century poetry, so I'm an interloper here. But I did study Nabokov in college. I went to Wesleyan University and studied Nabokov's novels with Priscilla Meyer there. So just luckily, I happened to take class with another giant of the field. And then didn't think about or read Nabokov at all in graduate school. And then I began in 2019 thinking about a new book project that for the first time wouldn't be defined by a historical sweep. It wouldn't be a historical narrative. It would be comparative and topical. And my book is about the many different ways that literature, especially poetry, especially 14th century and especially contemporary poetry, resist our understanding. And for that, I thought actually Nabokov was perfect because he has an intrusive, aggressive, authorial presence that appears to block interpretation. And that's simultaneously the challenge of studying him and the delight of studying him. In fact, in that way, he really resembles the medieval poets that I care about, especially the 14th century poets like Geoffrey Chaucer and William Langland. Medieval literature tends to come with its own ideas of what it means, with its own signposts. And the challenge as a medievalist is to sort of figure out what you think about those signposts and either accept them or modify them. But when you modify them, you know you're sort of running against the grain of what the text wants you to think. And reading Nabokov is like that too. There's a clear what he wants you to think, and you have to decide whether to accept or dodge it. Then during my last sabbatical, I was returning to Nabokov. At first, I thought that one of the novels I'd studied with Priscilla Meyer was The Real Life of Sebastian Knight, a novel that doesn't get enough play, actually, in Nabokov's studies. It's his first English novel. So I also care a lot about language. And to me, the first English novel is inherently interesting. This decision and incredible achievement of translating his literary prowess from his native language to another language learned young, but not a native language. And certainly not a language that he was schooled in terms of literature, right? When he went to university, he studied French and Russian, not English literature. So it wasn't a language that you would necessarily expect him to have the fluency and fluidity with that he did have. So it's an incredible achievement, and also a powerful decision that he makes in the late 30s, early 40s. So the novel is 1941, and it's written in Paris on the eve of his journey to America. I was interested in writing a chapter about his novels within novels. And it was then like 2020, it was lockdown, and you couldn't even see a lot of the books anymore, but they had, if you remember, they had opened up a lot of digital copies of books that are normally not open. So it was actually perfect for me because what I was looking for were scenes in his novels that were about fictitious novels. And so I hadn't read most of the novels. I was kind of browsing these different scenes, and suddenly I noticed that there was a ton of passages like this in his gigantic 1969 novel, Ada. At any rate, I couldn't stop reading the novels. I thought I'll read a couple that have like a lot of these motifs in them, but in fact, the motifs spider out through his whole work, and there was no obvious point of stopping, and my completist impulses took over. And so I spent most of the sabbatical reading like all the novels of Nabokov, a few of which didn't make it into this chapter in the book. And then this chapter is a sort of second output of that reading and thinking. Because here I'm again talking about novels within novels, but focusing on one particular one, this novel Success, that has a very specific plot line. He says within the real life of Sebastian Knight, he says the point of success is how fate continually contrives to bring two people together and then fails, and then maybe finally succeeds, so that in retrospect, the two people can see that they almost met on a number of occasions. In other words, the lines that lead them to one another are not straight. It's not a pyramid or triangle. It's an asymptote. So that was my starting point, but I looked at the way that Nabokov's earlier and later fiction kind of reverberate with that plot line, as well as the real life of Sebastian Knight itself. I should shout out one other big influence on how I read Nabokov, which is my colleague and also a PhD alum of ours, Lauren Wilwarding. She's a Victorianist, but her dissertation introduces a concept of analeptic reading, so reading that sends you from the end of something back to the middle, which is not the normative way to read a Victorian novel, so she's choosing a really hard case in advancing analeptic reading for Victorian novels, but to me, it's the perfect description of what I love in medieval poetry, which frequently the ending is an anticlimax that makes you re-understand the middle of the poem. And then also Nabokov. So many of his endings, the real life of Sebastian Knight is just an example. The ending scene is something that happens chronologically in the middle of the novel or even in the past of the novel, but which you've never seen depicted before. And it's an incredible, poignant effect because you've heard about the scene and you've heard about the scene and you understand what the characters all think about what happens in the scene, but you never see it until the closing pages, which are set maybe in the past or the middle. So he enforces you to kind of read analeptically in that way. And then even more than I did in my book chapter, in this chapter, in the Angst and Asymptote essay, I'm really concerned with the pair of novels that lie on either side of Nabokov's switch in language. So to me, the novel that is closest to the real life of Sebastian Knight in intention, temper, style, and everything is its immediate preceding novel, The Gift, in Russian, it's so clear reading that novel that he knew it was the last Russian novel. It's summative. It includes within itself all the other key elements of all the previous Russian novels. And he says in the preface that the heroine of the novel is not actually the leading lady, but Russian literature. It has gotten a lot of play, I think, in Russophone scholarship, but because people who can't read Russian like myself have this, it beats you over the head with the fact that you really need to know Russian literature in and out to fully grasp this novel. So it hasn't also gotten the play that I think it deserves, because even if you don't know everything there is to know about Russian literature, it's an incredible, massive, epic novel, and very funny. And it's, I think, his warmest novel. But at any rate, I became interested in thinking of the gift and the real life of Sebastian Knight as twins on either side of the language barrier or the language translation. And that he makes them refer to each other, so that there are plot lines in the gift that point ahead to the real life of Sebastian Knight. So it ends with this kind of success motif thing where the leading man and the leading lady realize they almost met a number of times. And then also the real life of Sebastian Knight looks back at the gift, and there are plot lines and fictitious novels inside of Sebastian Knight that resemble the gift, but he knows he's writing for an English-speaking audience who doesn't know anything about his Russian novels, because it wasn't translated into English at the time. So the fictitious novel that you can't read also sort of bleeds into the actual novel that you can't read because you're merely an Anglophone reader. So he's also having a joke, or sort of anticipating the bifurcation of his readership into Russophone and non-Russophone in a very clever way. So I think I will end there, but I'm, again, very grateful to be part of this group, and thank you.
Thanks so much, Eric. And as a side note, I am waiting for you to start taking Russian, because there is a pattern that Nabokov scholars who begin as students of Anglo-American literature end up also taking Russian, because they look for hidden clues. And that was the case with Brian Boyd, Nabokov's dominant biographer, who is a New Zealander, and who, for various reasons, end up helping Nabokov's widow with the archive, and he started asking questions. And that eventually led to his mastering the Russian language. So, Eric, basically the door is open. Yes, and I'm very happy to have Katie Pelkey join us. Katie is a recent graduate of the MA program here. She's a scholar and a creative writer. And in fact, several people on this panel are both. I think Nabokov does not just attract translinguals and immigrants. It also attracts people who think of scholarship as the flip side of creative writing, and vice versa. Katie.
Yeah, thank you, Maxime. I just wanted to say first, thank you again for having me here today. It's really such an honor to be able to kind of yap about all the reasons why I love Nabokov so much, and also sort of describe the ways that he's been such a big influence on my recent work, which is in poetry, as Maxime mentioned. So when I was in this course, one of the things that I was really drawn to the most while I was reading Nabokov is technique. As a creative writer, I'm always looking for that when I read. How are things being executed? How can I sort of imitate what I'm reading and, imitate the style or the skills and learn from what I'm reading? So one thing that really struck out with Nabokov was his deployment of death as a literary technique, not just as like a dramatic occurrence in a scene. So often when he deploys a death, he, as I mentioned in the video, sort of interjects. He takes over the speaker's voice and reveals himself as an author. And at that point, you're sort of pulled out, but in a really pleasant way. You're pulled out of that lull that you sort of fall into when you're reading a novel. And you're sort of reminded that you're really just looking at a piece of really excellent craft. So that's one thing that really stuck out to me. So that's kind of where I decided to start for my paper. And so one way that he uses death as a device is to sort of extend a character's life and create a very open-ended text. So these characters tend to provoke thought. The death isn't just a sort of closed ending. They inspire thought. You sort of wonder what happened to them. Sometimes it's like very metaphysical what happens to them. It's not just that something happens to their body physically. You sort of wonder like where they went. And there are plenty of examples of this. One is from the text Glory, where the main protagonist, Martin Edelweiss, sort of vanishes at the end. But then you're sort of left wondering where he went, and there's sort of possibility that he re-entered a painting that was hanging above the childhood bedroom. So there's this sort of possible physical death, but there's also a metaphysical continuity that's implied at the end of the text. So one thing that I find really interesting too is Nabokov's own interest in time and timelessness, to be more specific. He's really interested in J.W. Dunn's theory of serial time. And in his autobiography, Speak Memory, he writes, "I confess, I do not believe in time. I like to fold my magic carpet after use in such a way as to superimpose one part of the pattern upon another." So as I'm thinking about these endings, and I'm thinking about the way he's deploying death as a sort of mechanism for continuity, I'm sort of wondering if these might be comments on his own thoughts about time and timelessness, which I just find really interesting. And so from there, I started thinking a lot about the idea of legacy. And I wonder so often when I'm reading Nabokov if he was sort of anticipating his own literary legacy by making his characters sort of transcend time. So in that same way, his books, just evidenced by the fact that we're all here talking about them today, sort of go beyond time and allow him to, continue to be alive, which is like so fascinating to me, especially as a creative writer. So as I've been looking closely at his endings, I've been also thinking a lot about how he's been a great influence on my own work. I've noticed that in a lot of his novels, or short stories even, feel very sonnet-like to me in the way that they sort of take a turn at the very end, just like a sonnet in the 13th and 14th line, usually the final couplet. It takes sort of a pivot, a turn from the original content or the theme of the poem. And in such a beautiful way, I think Nabokov's works do that too. They sort of exit themselves, turn in a new direction that's often very surprising and really, really satisfying as a reader. So in my recent work, I've been reading a lot of Charles Simic, so I decided to share a poem that I find so related to the works of Nabokov. It's remarkably similar, and I will discuss that a little bit, but the poem is called Two Dogs. Two dogs for Charles and Holly. An old dog afraid of his own shadow in some southern town. The story told me by a woman going blind one fine summer evening, as shadows were creeping out of the New Hampshire woods, a long street with just a worried dog and a couple of dusty chickens, and all that sun beating down in that nameless southern town. It made me remember the Germans marching past our house in 1944, the way everybody stood on the sidewalk, watching them out of the corner of the eye, the earth trembling, death going by. A little white dog ran into the street, got entangled with the soldier's feet. A kick made him fly as if he had wings. That's what I keep seeing. Night coming down, a dog with wings. So one thing that I find really remarkably similar to Nabokov is just the otherworldliness that Simic creates in this poem. I mean, we have the dusty chickens and the earth trembling. It just sort of takes you out of, it takes you sort of into another world as you're reading it, which reminds me so much of reading a Nabokov novel. He also frames this, interestingly enough. Simic frames this poem as sort of a story within a story, which is actually what Eric was talking about. I find it really interesting that Simic and Nabokov both are sort of making in this case, the poet's voice so present, so at the forefront of the poem, sort of reminding you that you are kind of partaking in this crafted thing, and you're not just lulled by the poem itself. You're sort of reminded that it's a crafted thing. And finally, this dog that comes in at the end, he, just as I've mentioned in my paper, sort of transcends death. He's a dog that lives at the end. He has wings. And I think that sort of turn that I was mentioning earlier, like the way the sonnet kind of makes that final turn, is just so lovely in the Simic poem, and also so mirroring of Nabokov. And I can't help but think of dog with wings as being sort of similar to the image of the butterfly, which of course, as we all know, Nabokov was a big fan. So with that, I will conclude and pass it over to Matthew. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks so much, Katie. And I so appreciate the reference to Charles Simic, or Simic, who, of course, is a major translingual voice in post-war American poetry, who comes from the former Yugoslavia, and who, along with Joseph Brodsky, really are the voices we think of who certainly look to Nabokov for inspiration. They were a generation younger. So I think that's a wonderful, wonderful observation. Thank you. And I'm happy to welcome Matthew Leiberg back to our halls. So one thing you should know is that Matthew, unlike most of this group of contributors, Kevin Ohi and Eric Weiss-Scott, excepting because they're on the faculty, the others were all students in the one Nabokov seminar that I taught back in 2022, right? 23. So Matthew is a veteran and a graduate of the first ever Nabokov course that I taught here. Not to bore you with details, but back when I had my on-campus interview here in the winter of 1995, our then dean was the late Robert Barth, S.J., Bob Barth, who was a professor of English. And one of the things he asked me, because he knew I was working on Nabokov, I would be interested in teaching a course. And I said I was tickled pink to hear that. And I offered it soon after coming to BC. And Matthew was a Russian major. And I say this because the question of other worlds has come up a number of times. It's certainly a key concept with Nabokov. And there are many different other worlds in this book, not just metaphysical, historical, linguistic, and cultural. And I think Matthew is particularly interesting because for him, the Russian language and Nabokov became windows onto various other worlds, and he'll tell you where it led him. Matthew, are you going to want to show some pictures? Because I can try to set it up while you're speaking.
Yeah, maybe we'll give it a whirl.
Okay, so please.
Thank you very much. So I wasn't a Russian major, I was the Russian major. I was the only Russian major in my class, which you think would give me a good shot at the departmental prize. It did not. It did not. Very high standards at the Department of Slavic and Eastern Languages. What's interesting here is this was not my first senior thesis. This was my second senior thesis. The first senior thesis went down in a torrent of bad decisions the fall of my senior year, or good decisions, depending, on how you think about fate and different paths that lead us there. But I want to share with you, for me, this project from the beginning was about scholarship and creativity, although I didn't know that, but that's what I got out of it. Because what did it mean to be a scholar? For me, that first thesis was something that I had to do, that was a requirement, part of the honors program. And it was a bit of a drudgery. I'd see the books, I had the books checked out, I couldn't really open them. It was on a border issue in a political science thesis, had to do with Russia, Southern Russia, doesn't matter. But it was, I think, December, very cold, very miserable, and my first draft was due. And I had to go to Professor Shrayer's office with nothing. And I don't know if you've had these moments in life where you kind of have to, you're in a position where you really have to think about who you are and what that means. So I was no longer an honor student. I wouldn't be doing a senior thesis. It sounds almost kind of trite now, but at the time it was like, where am I going to go? What am I going to do with this? Like,
this idea of this important, I mean, Boston College made a mistake my freshman year. I wasn't invited to the honors program, so I talked my way into it with Father Appleyard. Just, I dropped into his office, I think, one of the first days of classes and said, there's been an oversight, but we can correct it. He kindly did. You know, so I was kind of always at the fringes of it. And I was coming in and I was absolutely devastated. One, because Professor Shrayer, one of those professors whose high standards kind of raises you up, right? And going in there was one of the hardest things I think I've done, strangely, which remains, even with all this life experience, to go to somebody you deeply respect and disappoint. And I was expecting sort of a bit of a wake for what could have been. Of course, this one grabs his coat and says, let's go for a walk. It's like, all right, we're walking. And we're walking down Com Ave. And Maxim is talking about how thesis is generally kind of a useless exercise that nobody reads. And a poorly written thesis is like a pain for both the student and the professor. Like nobody wins. And nobody reads them, and it's kind of useless unless you're thinking of doing a PhD or going on. Why bother? And we were talking, kind of moved on, like, okay, this is good, walking down Com Ave. And I think you said something like, didn't you take pictures in Russia? Because I'd done the Russian study abroad with BC and was paired with this incredible Russian photographer. And basically, I think it's okay to admit this, the 10-year rule has passed. I would do all of my Russian literature studies from like 6 a.m. Sunday to probably midnight Sunday, and then photograph the rest of the time. That's all I did. And so it was very exciting exploration for me, and came back with some pictures, and Professor Shrayer said, you know, Nabokov lived in Boston. It might be interesting to go about his haunts and see what that was like. And we were at the bottom of Com Ave, and suddenly we were turning around. I think you had some note cards. You were scribbling books that I had to check out. And it went from one of the lowest points of my academic career to one of the highest. It was like just this unbelievable feeling of energy and hope and excitement. And that is what I learned about scholarship from this project. It has to be something that is pulling you, that you has to get out, that you want to do, that you want to pursue. And that was kind of how it went for me. Should we go through a couple?
Do you want to?
Yeah, maybe I'll
and just flip through some of the pictures.
Yeah, we'll do a quick gallop.
They're all in the book. Well, not all of them. Some of them are in the book. Not we did many more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What was interesting here, you know, we kind of touched on the theme of Nabokov's suburban life. And for me, kind of as like a failed photographer, I thought about like, oh, if only I could, you know, be this tortured creative genius, right? Have this like solitude. And here we have the American dream. Only a couple blocks from Wellesley. I think this is 19 Appleby Road. I had to reshoot this because I got the address wrong. So I had to go back. But this is it. Look, you got a little writer's nook up top. Why didn't Nabokov stay there? That was interesting. Oh, one more comment I should just make about the logistics of this. I found this the second time, my second lap through the thesis, 2 years ago, reading the lectures on literature, when Nabokov mentions in Ulysses, if you're going to read Ulysses, you need a map. I'd like to think I came across that, but I didn't. But I did have a dear friend in college. Her father, Ernest Ringer, was a transit operator who had driven a lot of the routes. So he showed me on a map what the bus lines would have been like from Wellesley to Cambridge. So this is Wellesley. He has the interest in butterflies, so he's going back and forth from Wellesley to Cambridge. This is the Zoological Museum, right? And this was the other problem. How does one of the world's great authors spend 12 hours a day sorting dusty butterflies? What the hell? Yeah, like go create, but what, I mean, that for me was a central problem, especially the second lap that I struggled with. Like, the collection was a hot mess, according to Brian Boyd, and he toiled almost for an entire summer getting it in order, and then only then began his etymological research. So what does that mean? This this barrier to the art. And we go from this house in Wellesley to this apartment in Craigie Circle in Harvard. And these are small apartments, right? And so in Brian Boyd's book, they talk about the only luxury they allowed themselves was sending their son to private school, right? So, okay, this is that rejection of that suburban mid-century, beautiful Cape Cod kind of house with to an apartment. And so in Cambridge here, he's still teaching at Wellesley. So he's still got a hell of a bus ride. He's still dissecting butterflies or doing whatever you do at a zoological museum and writing. This is Maynard Place. This is a little bit after when they were just visiting here. But what's interesting, these were hard photographs for me because they're super boring. What is this? I mean, dear gosh. Okay, he lived here. But it was in the points in between you start to get a feel maybe for some of these moments. The world of Nabokov stories, right? This idea of Nabokov using poetry to convey the otherworldly, the transcendental. So what's this connection between the daily life, the butterfly dissection that we all have to do to some degree? I get it now because I have to write a lot of code, or at least I did until AI was a thing. This was one night, 2, 3 a.m., something like that. And this incredible, of course I was up studying, Saturday night or something. And so I dragged my roommate, Patrick Hess, out. We brought our other friends Patrick's Jeep to go shoot. So if you're at BC, there's a lot of Patricks and Sean's and Matthews. This is the Weeks Footbridge. Right? And so if we think about some of the scenes in Ben Sinister, the Weeks Footbridge was there when Nabokov was teaching at Harvard, right? When he was living in Cambridge. They would take Dmitri up walks up and down the Charles River at all times of day and night. This isn't the American family, right? This is, they're walking, they're getting out, they're strolling. Here we have young Patrick and 2 burly, I think, football players that were kind enough to pose on the bridge. And so this is Ben Sinister, as Krug, trudging steadily approached, 2 equalist soldiers barred his way. Would he have seen this? I don't know. But as soon as the camera clicked, everything started to move, to gush, and he walked on jerkily. He felt an intimate connection with the black lacquered water lapping and heaving under the stone arches of the bridge. Ben Sinister. Doomed to walk back and forth on a bridge which was ceased to be one, since neither bank is really attainable. He entered the elevator, which greeted him with a small sound he knew, half stamp, half shiver, and its features lit up. He pressed the 3rd button. The brittle, thin-walled, old-fashioned little room blinked, but did not move. He pressed again. In one of those express elevators manned by delicate hands, my own in a negative picture of dark-skinned men with thinking stomachs and rising hearts. Street seemed to be full of dim little pubs. This is Wellesley. This was, I think, one of the only lecture halls I could find that they hadn't renovated. So I think they use it in every period piece in Wellesley. I think there's a Julia Roberts movie. And that brings us to the end. So for me, it was that exploring the lines and then maybe experiencing some of that transcendence, some of that connection. So thank you so much for this opportunity. It was a thrill.
Thanks so much, Matthew. And before I turn the floor over to Nina, I just want to say, as an aside, that Matthew mentioned that the Nabokovs, who really struggled financially until the move to Ithaca, where Nabokov had a professorship and was well compensated. But they did pay for private school, and Dmitri, whom I got to know quite well, the late Dmitri Nabokov, he attended several private schools, including St. Mark's, but oddly had a miserable experience there because he was one of the few kids who was Jewish, and he was baited, even though he was actually a kind of feisty guy who, had to use his fists to defend his honor. And why I mention this is I've done extensive archival research on Nabokov. St. Mark's refused to let me see the file on Dmitry Nabokov to this day, and I have made numerous attempts, which is kind of infuriating because obviously it's been so many years, but there is something in those files that they clearly don't want to share. Imagine that. In any case, Nina, who is our last panelist, who is a poet and a scholar, took on an extremely difficult and ambitious topic, even though scholars prior to Nina had written about Joyce and Nabokov. What Nina did was a whole archaeology of knowledge going back to when Nabokov was a young Russian expatriate at Trinity College at Cambridge who was reading a copy of the Ulysses smuggled in from Paris. From that to Nabokov's late American and Swiss years. And I'm really proud, Nina, of your project, and thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much, and thank you to Dean Kalscheur and my alma mater, Boston College. This is my favorite room on campus, so this is really special for me to be here. And I guess I'll start by correcting Maxim a slight bit, because Vladimir Nabokov actually didn't read Ulysses, but it was read to him. So let me read the first line, I guess, of my paper. It requires little imagination to picture university students smuggling contraband into their dormitories. It is amusing, however, to picture that around 1922, one of these items of contraband was a blue goatskin cover copy of Joyce's Ulysses, brought from Paris to Cambridge University by Peter Murawski, friend of the young Vladimir Nabokov. Banned in England in 1922, Ulysses introduced Nabokov to the literary use of sexually explicit, if metaphorical, language. Murawski read the more explicit sections of Molly Bloom's soliloquy to Nabokov while he was trying to study for finals. So that is the opening, and obviously both of these authors are so special to me. I was exposed to both Joyce's Ulysses and all of Nabokov's novels at the same time in 2 seminar classes at BC, so this is kind of a culmination of those research projects that I did my junior year as an undergraduate. I want to talk about Professor Shrayer, who gave me the opportunity to write about these 2 authors in my chapter. In the many conversations that I've had with Professor Shrayer, the ones that I hold most fondly in my memory were when we discussed expatriatism, immigration, and the translingual writer. My own family history makes these topics so fascinating to me, and Professor Shrayer's discussion of them in the context of Vladimir Nabokov was the most important factor that went into crafting my chapter. Invitation to a Beheading, due to its indeterminate setting and Cincinnatus's vague situation, he is arrested and sentenced to death for Gnostical turpitude, has driven this Nabokov book's analysis to be highly engaged in metaphor and comparison. Katie actually gives a great discussion of this on page 174 of the book. Most of the time, people compare this novel to Kafka's The Castle, and of course, they make the real-world connection to the Holocaust, as Cincinnatus is persecuted on unreasonable and biased grounds. The more obvious point of my article is drawing a comparison between the character Leopold Bloom from Joyce's Ulysses and Cincinnatus to show how one author, Nabokov, uses the techniques of another, specifically subtlety and illusion, to craft a stereotyped character, in this case, to give Cincinnatus stereotypically Jewish characterization. More importantly, though, I wish that readers of my chapter think of Joyce, Nabokov, Bloom, and Cincinnatus as beyond their aesthetic and technical values. This inclination does not come directly from me, but from my education at Boston College, which emphasizes understanding the whole person, the whole being in context, body and soul. This is also Professor Shrayer's style of teaching this one-author course on Nabokov. How can we capture Nabokov's whole experience the best way we can through his written work? Nabokov and Joyce's most important connection was not drawn from the brief time they met, where Nabokov describes him in comparison to the Hungarian soccer players he's sitting next to, but through their writing. Both were expatriate writers, and how they capture the memories of their homeland, their loved ones, happens both in beautiful prosody and also in moments of intense suffering. Both authors are famous for subtleties and their subtext, But as I highlight in my chapter, there is a distinction between subtle writing and self-censorship. Nabokov, as he dissolves the world of Cincinnati moments before the character faces his death sentence, saves his beloved character from suffering. Similarly, Joyce, although he captures some painful moments Bloom undergoes as he thinks about his son who passed away, his failing relationship with his wife, and his otherness as a Jew in Dublin, is able to return home safely to 7 Eccles Street at the end of the day, living peacefully, awaiting his next, his problems left for future days. Both authors have a propensity to love and protect their characters from a greater suffering that the authors themselves found in their real world. For Nabokov, this is undoubtedly the suffering caused by Stalinism and Hitlerism, and for Joyce, his suffering is closer to home, his family life, his relationship with his father and his brother, and of course, Dublin. And although Joyce refused to admit it, the effects of a world at war. Just as Bloom and Cincinnatus censor their thoughts, they cut themselves off continuously with ellipses and sentence fragments. Joyce and Nabokov attempt to censor their contemporary real-world suffering in their novels. Crafting this project was so important to me because of what I learned at Boston College from Professor Shrayer and all my colleagues. To understand a being as a whole, we must engage in detailed study of their experience. Professor Weisskott says a similar thing in his chapter on page 42, where he remarks on scholars who attempt to read Nabokov in piecemeal. Katie also discussed this as she views Nabokov in the context of many of the novels across his life. And similarly, Matthew does this visually in a photo essay that captures Nabokov's real world in the context of his written work. So setting scholarly ambition and purposes aside, this project is important to me as it reveals aspects of modernity that come from we as human beings when we face challenges. Although Joyce and Nabokov had a propensity to put suffering in subtext, they could never truly erase it. Instead, art becomes the medium in which we can best draw their real-world experiences, despite both authors' attempts to dissuade us from doing so. Whether or not this drive to study real-world experiences of authors is important to scholars, I find that it's very important to me as a reader, as I live a fuller life by understanding the lives of others. I'm so grateful to be a part of this project that attempts to bring the voices of undergraduates, graduate students, and professors together to capture a moment in our time when we are all thinking of Nabokov in context of our lives, but also attempting to leave a lasting impact on Nabokov studies. My greatest hope is that work like this book continues to transpire at Boston College and other universities. I hope that my contribution to both fields of Joyce and Nabokov studies leads to an exploration of hidden narratives and diverse approaches to novels that have already been discussed. And then the last thing that I will say, as I move on, hopefully, into more studying and writing in my future, I will never forget when Professor Shrayer asked me to go to O'Neill Library, go to the one section that has all of Nabokov's books, flip to the end in the index and scan every index for mentions of James Joyce to make sure that all my citations were correct and that I wasn't leaving anybody out. So I learned scholarly discipline from this project most of all. So I thank everyone who contributed to this book, and I'm so glad that we get to have this release event in the Irish Hall.
Thank you so much, Nina and Matthew and Katie and Eric. I realized that I misspoke earlier. There are 2 contributors to the book here with us, Megumi Dumont and Fiona Stacy. And I would like to give each of them a chance to comment briefly from the floor. And maybe we'll take 1 or 2 questions. And I think we have a reception that Dean Kalscheur has generally prepared for us. So good to see you, Fiona.
Good to see you too. Yeah, I am slightly unprepared, but thank you everybody for contributing to this book. To Nina's point, it was wonderful to be a part of a project that brought people together across just different stages in their career. I personally am sort of on a bit of a hiatus from my academic career, so being able to be a part of this was excellent. Thank you.
There we go. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Professor Shrayer, for introducing me. My So a bit of background about me. I'm working at a university now. I live in Seattle. I work in administrative side of things. So I really loved how the panel was a diverse. It showed the cross-section of the themes that went through this book. Mine was focused on the metaphysical aspects of Nabokov's work, similarly to how Katie was exploring the metaphysical elements in his the textual deaths. But Nabokov also had an extreme interest in and extensive background in visual art, specifically painting, not just writing. And so I explored how 2 short stories where visual art was central to those stories helped drive some of those metaphysical time-space collapsing of all of those things in those stories. And yeah, definitely a rigorous experience working on this chapter, and I'm really happy and feel lucky to have had the guidance from Professor Shrayer and others at Boston College. So yeah, thank you, everyone.
So a lot of my own like personal academic interest is like vested very much in like popular culture and popular media. And I know that Nabokov has kind of had this like afterlife with Lolita specifically in film and television. So I was wondering if this was like maybe extended as a project, like how would people account for film and television legacies of him and his work? If that's come up in the research at all.
I'm not the person to write this, but this question is an example of Nabokov beating us to the punch, because in one of his earliest novels, there's a hilarious scene of Hollywood producers approaching a writer, and he completely predicts the chaotic hubbub around Lolita. And then in a later novel, The Gift, he gives the plot of Lolita, before he'd ever written the novel, to this heinous landlord who aspires to write a novel about a pedophile. And so, once again, Nabokov beat us to the topic.
This is an invitation for you, Maxine, to say more about the reception, because some of the things you found in our Burns Library are the correspondence of Graham Greene and his defense and this appraisal of Lolita. So maybe, whom I recognize, they didn't recognize that we have some of these materials you might explore. So say something about that, Maxine.
Okay. Thank you very much, Christian. First of all, we acknowledged you in the flick, but I want to acknowledge you again for all your help. You would be surprised to know that our own research libraries, specifically the Burns Library, has archival holdings that shed new light on Nabokov that we published in the book. Specifically, we are fortunate to have the papers of Graham Greene as part of BC's interest in Anglo-Catholic writers. And Graham Greene was instrumental in turning the tide in favor of the publication of Lolita in America and the UK, because initially Nabokov shopped Lolita and no publisher would touch it, even though we already had the Ulysses decision and a strong precedent to distinguish between classic pornography and great literature. And so it came out in Paris in 1955, but basically Graham Greene was the one who declared Lolita a great novel and led a campaign defending it, promoting it, and in our archival holdings here, we have letters from Nabokov to Graham Greene, which are included, the text and facsimile, but also, and I'm particularly moved by this story, we have the correspondence between Francis Sweeney, S.J., who was a visionary professor, Jesuit, and who directed the Humanities series, which is now the Lowell series, who keeps inviting Nabokov with persistence to come to BC. And what is interesting, when Nabokov was living in the Boston area for almost a decade, his first American decade, I don't think he made connections with the academics here. But in the 1960s, he was aware of BC, and his wife replies in detail. What is interesting is she refers to Boston College as the Boston College. That's how it is in the letters. Mr. Nabokov would be delighted to come to the Boston College, and these letters are also in the book. And I think there is a bit more to this story, but maybe as a sequel, we'll have an event specifically focusing on the archival dimensions. Because, as you know, archival research is like a drug. You can never have enough.
Thank you, Maxime. Thank you to all of our panelists. Congratulations on the publication of the book. Consider it well launched here in the Irish Room. Thanks to everybody for coming. I didn't prepare the reception, but in a sense I provided it, so we can enjoy conversation and further good company as we have a drink or a snack. So thank you all, and good evening.